Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Library Company of Philadelphia's event, our Black History Month event, Jubilee's Experiment, British Emancipation in the Caribbean and Black History in America with Dr. Dexter Gabriel. Tonight's program is presented by the Library's Program in African American History. I'm your host. My name is Carla Peterson. I am a member of the library's board of directors. I chair our programming committee, so I'm very vitally interested in every single program that gets shown. I'm also a professor emerita from the University of Maryland Department of English, and my field is 19th century African American literature and cultural studies. So Dr. Gabriel's talk is right up my alley, and I hope you'll be as interested in it as I am. I thank you all for attending tonight's event. It's great to have all of you with us. And Dr. Gabriel will be talking for about 45 minutes after I finish my introduction, and we'll have a Q&A session. And if you want to ask a question, please do so by using the Q&A feature on Zoom. So before we begin tonight's talk, I want to tell you a little bit about the Library Company. It was founded in 1731, that's almost 300 years ago, by Benjamin Franklin. And it is today an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th century through the 19th. It's free and open to the public, and it houses an extensive collection of non-circulating books, rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. The mission of the Library Company is to foster scholarship and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the valuable materials in our care. The library connects with thousands of visitors annually, ensuring that the lessons of the past will continue to amaze, instruct, and inspire future generations. And I know something about that, having done a lot of research at the Library Company. I invite you all to go. The curators are amazing. They will dig up stuff for you that you never thought was possible. I've studied Philadelphia literary societies there, the early African American private academies. I even did a piece on handwriting, and I had a handwriting expert there help me. It's just an amazing place. Anyway, we serve, but beyond professors like me, we also serve a diverse constituency throughout Philadelphia and the nation, offering comprehensive reader services, an internationally renowned fellowship program, online catalogs, and regular exhibitions and public programs. Since the creation of the Library Company, shareholders have formed the backbone of the community. Being a shareholder keeps you more connected to us, opens the door to exclusive member events and opportunity, and allows you to own a unique piece of the Library Company history. So I myself am a shareholder. I've been a shareholder for many years, and I invite you to join me in that shareholding, in the shareholding community. And I think in the chat, you can get the website or the link for finding out more about shareholding. So about Dr. Dexter Gabriel, he earned his BA in history from Texas State University, San Marcos, and MA in history also from Texas State University, San Marcos, and his PhD from Stony Brook University. His research, and he currently is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. His research interests include the histories of slavery, resistance, and freedom in the Black Atlantic, as well as interdisciplinary approaches to slavery within popular culture and media. He teaches courses ranging from African American history up to 1865, comparative slavery in the Americas, and slavery in film, just to name a few of his courses. His book, titled Jubilee's Experiment, The British West Indies and American Abolitionism, and that's his talk is going to be part of that book, explores British emancipation in the Anglo-Caribbean and its impact on abolitionist strategies in the 19th century United States. Welcome, Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Allison and Carla. Thank you, Carla, for that great introduction. Thank you, Allison, for extending the invitation that allowed me to be here today. I'm delighted to return to the Library Company of Philadelphia, where I spent a summer in residence, and though they're no longer there at the time, I want to thank Eric Armstrong Dunbar, as well as librarian Crystal Appy at the time, who really helped me while I was there. And so thank you guys for all of that. And Allison, this would be a great time for my slides, if you get a chance. Anyway, so tonight I'm here to talk about my book, Jubilee's Experiment, which examines how the emancipated British Caribbean colonies entered into debates over abolition and African-American citizenship in the United States from the 1830s through the 1860s. My book analyzes this public discourse created by Black and white abolitionists and African-Americans more generally in antebellum America as both propaganda and rhetoric. Simultaneously, I also interweave the lived experiences of formerly enslaved people in the British West Indies, their daily acts of resistance and struggles for greater freedoms, to further augment but complicate this debate. In essence, Jubilee's experiment argues that the measured success of former enslaved people in the British West Indies became a crucial focal point in the struggle against slavery in antebellum America. And I hear here on this first slide, you can see my book cover image. And if you go on to the next slide, if you could please for me, Allison. We see here, this is where I was fortunate enough to take this image from. And it's actually an image from the National Library of Jamaica, and it was done in 1838 to commemorate the end of slavery. And there's a lot going on in this image. They were able to crop a bit from my book, but it's just a fascinating look at the ideology at the time, in this time being emancipated Jamaica, as you see many of these people in attendance, both former slave owners as well as enslaved people, allegedly celebrating the end of slavery in Jamaica. So since we are in Black History Month, what I want to talk about this evening is specifically how antebellum African Americans incorporated British emancipation in the West Indies into their rhetoric for abolitionism and equal citizenship rights in the United States, within speeches, in print, and through public performances. Free African Americans helped shape a popular discourse in defense of what they called freedom's experiment. The successful emancipation of West Indian slaves, they argued, would demonstrate the efficacy of immediate emancipation, repudiate charges of Black inferiority, and provide a model for racial democracy in America. So my focus today is really going to be on African Americans, and because we are at the LCP, I'm going to try to bring in the city of brotherly love as much as possible. It means also that I'm only probably going to give brief mention to the free people of the Caribbean, who do play their own central role as I delve into in my work. However, for the purposes of this talk, I tried to narrow things down. But I'm hoping if anyone has questions about any of these missing elements, they come up in the Q&A, where I'll be happy to answer them, or at least try to my best ability to do so. So I want to set out, I guess, 3 topics to briefly examine. First, the importance of British emancipation to African Americans, how African Americans helped to shape and define what was termed the success of the experiment. And then lastly, third, how free African Americans utilized British emancipation, both in their arguments against American slavery and for equal citizenship rights in the United States. All right, and so I'll start off with that first topic by sharing a quote. This is me doing a quote here. But you may ask, what interest have we in this matter? Whatever has been done in the British West Indies, our condition, in point of fact, remains the same. Still, the act referred to is far from being totally without benefit to us. So far as the spread of correct principles on the great subject of human rights is concerned, we are materially benefited. For since the principle of moral justice has successfully triumphed over wrong and outrage there, can it be without its influence in bringing about the same glorious results here? Those words were spoken on August 1st, 1838, by the Black Philadelphia minister, William L. Douglas, to a Wednesday morning crowd gathered at St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church. Great time for the next slide, Allison, please. Thank you. And here is a picture, an image, an engraving at the time of St. Thomas Church. And as you note, as I'll try to do throughout this, many of these images come from the Library Company of Philadelphia, just to show what a great resource it is for this type of work. Founded in 1792 by Absalom Jones, St. Thomas housed the oldest Black congregation in Philadelphia. And in 1834, Douglas had been called to be its minister. That same year, on August 1st, 1834, the British Emancipation Act had freed by proclamation some 800,000 enslaved people, the majority of whom lived in the British West Indies. Since that day, African Americans and their allies had gathered annually in churches and halls throughout the Northeast to recognize the 1st of August, or West India Day, so those are the two names, often the 1st of August or West India Day, as a moment of anti-slavery triumph shared across the Atlantic. 1838 in particular was a special year, marking the end of the apprenticeship in the English Caribbean, right? The apprenticeship is this vestige of slavery that lingered on throughout most of the emancipated British colonies. It's the system of coerced labor that had been intended to last 8 years, where the free people were then supposed to give their labor to plantation owners or what have you. But the steadfast resistance of former slaves alongside agitation by English abolitionists led to its premature abandonment in 1838 early. To celebrate this more complete freedom, August 1st observances that 1838 in the United States were held in New York, throughout New England, and as far west as Ohio, right? And I guess I can go to the next slide. And this is simply a slide of the West Indies. This is earlier than the time period I'm talking about, but I wanted an older map to give an idea of not just the British West Indies, but the other places nearby. You can see up there, Florida, to remind that there's a proximity of the British West Indies to parts of the United States. And again, another image from the Library Company. Like other speakers that day, Douglas contrasted the triumphant spread of correct principles, as he called it, in the British West Indies with the crime of slavery in America. But he also asked a question directly of his congregants. What interest have we in this matter? It was something many African Americans may have silently interrogated as they celebrated the end of slavery in a set of foreign colonies. Douglas admitted as much, pointing out that the British Abolition Act had freed no slaves in the United States, and that the material, everyday condition of Black Americans remained unchanged. Douglas answered his own query, however, stating that despite separation by distance and national boundaries, the end of slavery in the English Caribbean held specific meanings, right, for African Americans. There were correlations, he maintained, between the emancipation of some 800,000 enslaved Black people under a foreign power with the fight to end slavery in America, and what he termed, this is his term, the disabilities faced by free Black communities. Douglas's speech reached beyond his Philadelphia congregation, reprinted in the Colored American, a Black newspaper published in New York. His rhetorical question could have been put to African Americans in diverse locales. Over the next few years, commemorations of August 1st or West India Day became a key event in the Northern United States. In New York, Pennsylvania, New England, Ohio, free African Americans and their allies celebrated the end of slavery in the British Empire in church services and picnics that eventually grew into these massive parades. August 1st commemorations themselves drew large crowds in the hundreds or more. These included a diversity of people, white and Black, men and women, what people often called at the time a promiscuous engagement of people. They drew important speakers, from the ex-slave and activist Frederick Douglass, who was a frequent speaker, to the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. The early Jewish feminist Ernestine Rose spoke, even the famed writer and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. All of them addressed these events. From the 1830s and through the Civil War, August 1st, or West India Day, would become the largest annual and continual abolitionist celebration in America. But these celebrations did not occur in a vacuum. In dailies and weekly newspapers, in pamphlets and books, in broadsides and bulletins and hymns, in poems and art, in print ephemera and more, abolitionists utilized British emancipation in their everyday writings, their rhetoric, their discourse, and their propaganda against American slavery. August 1st, the annual event, was but one part of a mass campaign to shape the perceptions of British emancipation. And most important, this is key, how that emancipation was progressing in the British West Indies. They argued that the success of Black freedom over there in the Caribbean would be a prediction of the success of Black freedom over here in America. Over the coming decades, free African Americans played a vital role in shaping the dialogue and debate of the meaning of freedom in the British West Indies, what one British official faithfully called the mighty experiment. African American activists incorporated the emancipated British West Indies into their rhetoric for abolition and equal rights, much as William L. Douglass in Philadelphia in his 1838 speech. They would create a Black defense of the experiment, a counter-narrative to negative depictions that spoke to the issues and concerns of free Black communities. In their vocal defense of Black West Indians, African Americans also spoke in defense of themselves, deploying arguments that reflect the themes of liberty, equality, and citizenship in the broader Atlantic. By the time William Douglass gave his speech in 1838, African Americans were pretty much versed on the struggle against slavery that was going on in the British West Indies now for at least a decade, primarily through print. Literary cultures we know had long served an important role in free Black life to agitate against slavery, advocate for political and social rights, disseminate pertinent news, and build a sense of a shared community. Much as Haiti had been closely followed, by the late 1820s, the British West Indies was on the minds of African American activists, as an English abolitionist campaign took hold across the Atlantic. The English abolitionist movement itself coincided with the arrival of independent African American newspapers. So for instance, in March 1827, Freedom's Journal was started in New York by the Presbyterian minister Samuel Cornish and the Jamaican-born activist John Brown Westworm. At its height, Freedom's Journal had a circulation of some 800 subscribers, and its articles were reprinted in the emerging white anti-slavery press. For instance, George Lundy's Genius of Universal Emancipation often reprinted its articles and helped build its subscription. Freedom's Journal boasted on carrying news on what it said was whatever concerns us as a people, including a steady stream of transatlantic discourse on the British Caribbean and anti-slavery in the English metropole. For instance, one March 1827 article in particular, addressed to the people of color of the United States, announced that to its readers that certain measures were underway by which every slave in the British dominions will soon be free. The work undertaken on what they said behalf of the children of Africa, it assured, would inevitably reverberate upon what they said was the welfare of 4 million of people held in bondage in America. Lauding the imminent arrival of British emancipation, the article openly questioned America's own self-identity as a nation of liberty and progress, right? Stating, it cannot be believed that while all the rest of mankind are advancing in the march of improvement, 2 million of the race in free America, with an emphasis there on free America, shall be left in irretrievable degradation. In its pages, Freedom's Journal cast the British campaign as a larger international anti-slavery struggle, at times even listing and comparing advertisements for runaways taken from American and West Indian newspapers, right? So they're showing these correlations to their readers. The impending freedom of hundreds of thousands of Black women, men, and children in the British Caribbean evoked in the paper's editors a sense of community unrestricted by national borders. Here were fellow enslaved people who could be imagined to encompass the broader Atlantic world through what an earlier generation had deemed the ties of consanguinity, of suffering, and of wrong. As the newspaper quoted at one point, it says, "There," meaning the British Caribbean slave population, "is in the immediate neighborhood of our own. They speak the same language. The intercourse is easy, constant, and unavoidable. When all the colored population in the West Indies comes to enjoy the civil rights and privileges of His Majesty's other subjects," it said, "what will be the condition of the Southern states?" You know, and in that quote, there's, I don't want to go as far as saying a threat, but certainly there's this implication that you can't keep this news from enslaved people who are living in the Southern states in the United States, because they speak the same language. They're going to see it in newspapers. It's going to go through the slave grapevine. And what is going to happen when they understand that these other enslaved people have now seen freedom? British emancipation coincided as well with big transformations and change for the movement against slavery in America. Young anti-slavery advocates like the Massachusetts journalist William Lloyd Garrison had supported organizations like the American Colonization Society, who encouraged the removal of Black people, slave and free, from the United States, and resettled them primarily in places like West Africa. But after reading the works of Black writers like the Philadelphia minister Richard Allen against colonization, Garrison turned away from gradual emancipation. He and other immediatists, so named for their calls for immediate rather than fragile approaches to ending slavery, believed that there could be no compromise with human bondage. This turn in abolitionism for figures like Garrison came out of his contact with free African-American communities in cities like Philadelphia. It came out of the Second Great Awakening that preached universal religious salvation as well as reform. It came out as well from the mass campaign to end slavery that was taking place simultaneously in Great Britain, and what it might mean for Britain's colonies in the nearby Caribbean, right? So when we move to this notion of defending the experiment, we have to realize that the outcome of emancipation in the West Indies, with it the very conceptualization of Black freedom, was of course a contested matter. When the British colonial secretary Edward Stanley in May 1833 introduced the Emancipation Resolution in Parliament, right, he referred to it as a mighty experiment. The experiment hinged primarily on the efficacy of free labor, which English abolitionists had promoted in their campaign as the substitution, as they would say, of wages for the whip. West Indian planters dissented, of course, that the laboring population would not work unless induced through force as they had been using. Even emancipation's political supporters were skeptical of these rosy predictions of wage labor success, voicing their concerns in often racialist beliefs on the innate disposition of Africans and the degrading nature of slavery. The British, for instance, the British Colonial Office clerk Henry Taylor spoke for many British parliamentarians, bureaucrats, and some reformers, musing on the eve of emancipation that freed Black West Indians would relapse into barbarous indolence if not properly regulated and guided into civil society. The great task of emancipation, as he saw it, was to devise a system of civil government to help lift a people made, as he quote, this is his words, made ignorant, destitute of moral cultivation, and habituated to dependence. In concession to these more conservative voices, the final Emancipation Act itself called for a reasonable compensation to slave owners for the deprivation of property and expected labor, amounting to an infamous indemnity of 20 million pounds. The bill also required, most infamously, a system of apprentice laborers, deemed a necessary transition for promoting the industry and securing of good conduct of the recently manumitted. With the parameters of the experiment itself in place, British abolitionists, politicians, colonial officials, missionaries, and newspapers set about observing the former West Indian slaves in order to measure freedom's success or failure. Allison, if I could have that next slide, please. Also taken from the library. Yeah, this is a slide called Slave Emancipation, or John Bull Gold out of 20 Millions. It's from London in 1833, this engraving. And if you look to the left of the image, you can see what it's supposed, this is satire, so you can see what's supposed to be a West Indian planter who's grown wealthy and off of the dealings of slavery. And you see him receiving money. He's receiving this 20 million pounds. You see next to him is a British parliamentarian basically robbing the pocket of John Bull. This is basically the John Q. Public in many ways of England. And this person is skeptical of all this. And the person with the broom may be a representative of William Wilberforce or another British abolitionist who is ensuring the British public that this is for their own good. But if you go over to the right, before you think this is a great social commentary on the exploitation of the English working class, which in part it is, it's not very helpful about what they think about the colonies, right, of enslaved people in the colonies. Here we see their imagination of what emancipation would bring. And what emancipation will bring are enslaved people who are now, as you see here, dancing and celebrating. They are drinking rum. They are sitting about idly. There's also, of course, the caricatures of them are racialist caricatures. They're waving around banners and freedom, and you can't read the bubbles, but they're speaking in this exaggerated, denigrating speech that they don't know what freedom is, but they're happy to do this, sit about idly. And so we see these negative perceptions shared by many, right, about what freedom itself will mean in the British West Indies once emancipation comes. So mainstream American newspapers, anti-abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates also, almost themselves, immediately declared the experiment of Black freedom in the West Indies a disaster, much as you see these satirists in Great Britain. As early as 1833, American newspapers warned that the West Indies would become overrun with Negro sovereignties, whose contagion would rapidly spread into the southern states following British emancipation. Less than a year after August 1st, 1834, a New York newspaper, for instance, declared the once lucrative British West Indian colonies were utterly ruined and prostrated by the Emancipation Act. The former slaves were said to have grown insolent with freedom, shirkers of work, lazy, immoral, sexually promiscuous, lacking in Christian instruction, and prone to violence. Another American newspaper claimed that in Jamaica, a 14-year-old Black boy stabbed a white child just 3 days after emancipation was passed, declaring, "I am now free," right? So this is the kind of rhetoric that we're seeing just as emancipation is passed and even before. These acts were deemed the pernicious results of suddenly letting loose, as they said, the Negro population, who upon freedom, as they saw it, had reverted to a state of savagery. In Barbados, American newspapers claimed free Blacks and their former owners were nearing a race war. One editorial even proposed the United States annex the British West Indian colonies to restore order. Now, if you're wondering, or if you're seeing visions here of Haiti and wondering if ideas of the specter of Haiti played a role here, the answer is yes. The revolutionary self-emancipation of Saint Domingue slaves remained fresh in the fears of American slaveholders and their allies. An Ohio newspaper predicted that the fate of San Domingo would soon enforce that same lesson in the colonies of the British Caribbean. More dangerous still was the fear that the fanatical abolitionists, as they called them, would transfer this foreign experiment to American soil. The ruin of Haiti, they said, would be the condition of our southern states, a newspaper warned, if the abolitionists had their will. Such within 7 years, it predicted, will be the condition of all the West India Islands belonging to Great Britain, right? And so we constantly see this anti-Haitian rhetoric, this fear, this comparison of British emancipation to Haiti that's constantly going on, this negative rhetoric. For pro-slavery advocates, basically Black freedom was equated with anti-modernity, civilization in reverse. One editorial even called any attempt to imitate what had taken place in the West Indies on American soil, they said it would be the death blow of our republic, resulting in a racial Armageddon leading either to slavery to the whites or to the Blacks' extermination, right? There's no middle road here as far as they're concerned. This is simply what will happen. If I can see one more slide, Allison. So this is another slide I got from the Library Company of Philadelphia that I featured within the book. I actually wanted to make this the book cover. My editor said, no way, too many words. But it shows here, it's called Immediate Emancipation Illustrated. It comes about in New York in 1833, right before the formation of the New York City Anti-Slavery Society. And to the right, there's a lot going on. I don't have time to go into the various political bits of satire, but the men there seated are supposed to be Arthur and Lewis Tappan, the New York abolitionists and businessmen, and the seated figure to the left is supposed to be William Lloyd Garrison. But I want to point you to the right, where you see a dark figure is supposed to be an enslaved man who is, well, this is supposed to be what emancipation means as far as they're concerned in the British Caribbean. And you see this formerly enslaved person is now gaunt and starving. He's wearing nearly just leaves. He is chasing, if you can see, he's chasing a fly. And the word coming out of his mouth is food, right? And in one of his hands, you may not be able to see this as well, he's holding a dagger, a knife. And behind him are these scenes that basically look like images out of Western text on Haiti, where at the time, where you see basically these dark Black figures murdering whites while everything is in fire and ruins. And so this is their idea, is what they're saying. This is what emancipation in the British Caribbean is going to look like. And this is what emancipation in the United States will look like, this editorial is arguing, if people like the Tapans and William Lloyd Garrison get their way, right? And so this is the images they have of immediate emancipation. For American abolitionists, these were attacks on what was thought to be the best experiment for immediate emancipation. For free African Americans in particular, these attacks were of a more personal nature. 800,000 former slaves had just become free citizens. If emancipation and the granting of citizenship to Black people could work in the British West Indies, they believed, it served as a site of possibility for racial democracy in the United States. In response, American abolitionists launched a defense of British emancipation and its workings in the West Indies, creating a countering narrative to the popular press that portrayed British emancipation this time as a success. Success itself was to be defined in two ways. First was the triumph of free labor, arguing that the former slaves of the British West Indies were more industrious and productive as free laborers. The issue of free versus slave labor had been debated since the 18th century by economists like Adam Smith. And in the United States, free labor ideology had been a growing sentiment that would continue to define the social and political ethos of the North. Moreover, in many ways, labor was often the terrain on which anti-abolitionists made their arguments against emancipation. So it's not surprising that abolitionists also chose this ground to make their arguments. Utilizing eyewitness reports, charts, economics, and mercantilist data, American abolitionists argued that emancipation had brought increased productivity to the West Indian colonies and an improvement in the work habits of the former slaves. As an 1836 New England paper with anti-slavery leanings assessed, in the British Caribbean, quote, "The Negro goes of an errand quicker and loiters less now he is paid than when he was a slave, and he was less sullen in his work." An August article that year in Garrison's Liberator noted that exports from the British West Indies had seen considerable increase instead of the diminution which was feared, and that those laborers, the Negroes, are quite as valuable as they were while held as slaves. In tying freedom to the British West Indies to the value of Black labor, which could be studied, measured, and analyzed, abolitionists proposed that Southern planters could reap greater rewards through a more humane and efficient regime where they employed free Black workers rather than slaves. African Americans were at the forefront of shaping this defense. In 1836, at the third annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in New York, the Black Philadelphia abolitionist Robert Purvis proposed a resolution calling on the multiracial gathering to regard the remarkable and happy results of the experiment of immediate emancipation in those West India islands as conclusive proof of the safety and policy of such emancipation. A follow-up resolution called for agents to be sent to the islands to gauge the success of freedom. By March 1837, Samuel Cornish's Colored American emerged as one of the most prominent Black newspapers of the era. Freedom's Journal had itself gone defunct earlier, able to offer an independent African-American assessment of the emancipated English Caribbean. Like other anti-slavery newspapers, the Colored American reprinted reports highlighting the success of free labor. Criticizing negative accounts, it labeled the American press mouthpieces of what it called a pro-slavery party in the West Indies and pro-slavites, as they said, in the South, right? Putting these two together, spreading misinformation about the glories of British emancipation. The reason the paper intimated was to hide news of the benefits of free labor, which rendered Southern arguments on the necessity of slave labor disingenuous. If such a system succeeded in the West Indies, the editors postulated, American slaveholders would be left without any apology for their inhuman, anti-civilized system. But while African Americans generally supported free labor arguments, they tended to place greater emphasis on the second major measure of emancipation success for anti-slavery and abolitionists, the moral reformation of 800,000 men, women, and children lifted, as they saw it, from the degradation of slavery into freedom. For African Americans, the former West Indian slaves had not only become more industrious, but more important, they had been improved socially, mentally, and spiritually by freedom, through education, religious learning, and proper moral instruction. The experiment, they argued, was more than a referendum on free labor success. It would also determine the reformative power of freedom as a refutation to claims of either innate or irredeemable Black degeneracy. Now, for African Americans, claims in these newspapers of the inability of former West Indian slaves to adapt to freedom rang with some familiarity, right? The social climate of the early 19th century America placed free Black people outside the bounds of the larger themes of expanded democracy, right? Since the era of the common man. As the North's free Black population grew, there are these biases against their inclusion in civil society. These things increase. You have states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois passing laws basically limiting Black immigrants. There are restrictions on Black suffrage enacted in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, while in 1838, Pennsylvania's newly ratified constitution moves to only recognize the voting rights of white freemen, right? This renewed political and social marginalization also followed along increased racial hostility in many parts of the North, as riots targeting free Blacks erupted in cities during the 1830s. The same year, for instance, Pennsylvania stripped suffrage from African-American men, the same year that the apprenticeship ends in the British West Indies. A white mob basically burned down Pennsylvania Hall in reaction to a multiracial abolitionist gathering. In 1842, in none other than an August 1st West India Day procession that's taking place in Philadelphia, celebrating British emancipation. It's set upon by white mobs, resulting in days of rioting that basically razed sections of Philadelphia's Black district, what many of you in Philadelphia may know as the Lombard riots, which take place not too far from the LCP, right? Robert Purvis, reeling from this violence, right? He's forced to stay at home armed to protect his home against these mobs, despaired at this mounting animosity. He writes, this white abolitionist, Henry Wright in England, he says, "I'm convinced of our utter and complete nothingness in public estimation at this time," right? The bloody will, he says, is in the heart of this community to destroy us. The reasons promoted for Black marginalization were often tied to predominant beliefs of innate Black inferiority. Anti-abolitionists like the American Colonization Society claimed that emancipation had caused degeneracy in free Black Northern populations. They looked to any instance of Black poverty or impoverishment as signs that such communities were, as they put it, ignorant, degraded, and miserable, mentally diseased, and broken-spirited. In 19th century New York, there are crime tracts printed that show the alleged propensity of free Blacks to theft, murder, and other social dysfunctions. Anti-abolitionists further argue that in their degeneration, free Black people existed outside the bounds of democracy, their non-whiteness, their previous proximity to slavery, even their work as domestics or in menial labor, right? All of these things made free Blacks, in their estimation, incapable of participating in American citizenship. Freedom, they argued, had rendered basically an already deficient race, as they saw it, not better, but worse. In the 19th century United States, stratified by race, class, gender, and various states of unfreedom, African-American elites negotiated ways to counteract this social stigma. And to be honest, more than a few, especially these elites, accepted some popular criticisms of what they saw as lower class Black people and those recently manumitted from bondage. But I want to stress there are these clear points of distinction delineated the two arguments. African-Americans' class-based contentions, which are certainly open to criticism, right? I'm not agreeing with them, rejected outright claims of innate Black behavioral deficiency, positing any such moral failings were rooted in systems of slavery. The colored American indicted slavery for rendering its victims, as they saw it, as indolent, licentious, intemperate, violent, revengeful, and unfeeling. Slavery, to paper charge, deprived the enslaved almost entirely of intellectual, moral, and religious instruction, leading women, as they called it, to prostitution and promiscuous intercourse, discouraging lawful marriage. Now, again, I'm not co-signing these beliefs, but unlike white racial conservatives, African-American elites argued that behavioral deficiencies, at least as they perceived them, could be ameliorated. In the era brought about by the Second Great Awakening, even the reputedly degraded slave could be improved through proper education and instruction. To argue the possibility of reform was to negate scientific racist assertions on the immutable nature of Blackness, and to implement a strategy which would inevitably lead to greater acceptance, freedom, and hopefully, as they saw it, equality. The 1837 founding of the American Moral Reform Society in Philadelphia was one of the many attempts by African-American elites to institute behavioral adjustments as a strategy of social mobility, right? As they put it, the moral, upright, and correct deportment of our people, and they put in this resolution, will be one of the strongest arguments we can present in favor of universal civil and religious liberty. African-American reformers readily adapted this domestic moral elevation rhetoric to their definitions of success in British emancipation. Over the centuries, an array of Baptists, Methodists, Moravians, and other missionaries had long made their way across the Atlantic to proselytize to enslaved West Indians. With emancipation, a new wave of religious and social reformers flocked to engage in the civilizing mission, one that complemented colonial attempts to regulate the newly freed population. They're working in concert here often. African Americans saw in these endeavors many of the same reformist impulses that drove them at home. Yet, unlike colonial attempts to control its populace, however, they envisioned a moral elevation which would eventually place Black West Indians on equal footing, as fully free citizens with control over their own lives. A June 1834 meeting, for instance, of the Annual Convention for the Improvement of People of Color in New York heralded emancipation in the West Indies as a momentous occasion, when the British dominions would be free from what they called the satanic monster of slavery. This success, they believed, would call on the United States to see the moral benefits of freedom. Only then, they argued, could those once enslaved rise in glory and triumph, reason, virtue, kindness, and liberty, and take a high exalted stand among the sons of men. To craft these arguments of moral reform, African Americans relied on favorable reports and writings gathered primarily by English missionaries and American visitors to the West Indies. In an 1837 article, for instance, the colored American apprised readers of an upcoming book by the abolitionist James A. Thome, editor of the Anti-Slavery Herald of Freedom, and Joseph Kimball, the son of a Kentuckian slaveholder converted to abolitionism. Following on the heels of Robert Purvis's resolution, the American Anti-Slavery Society had sent the two men on a 6-month tour of Antigua, Barbados, and Jamaica to determine the effects of the great experiment of freedom. The colored American informed its readers that Kimball and Thome had lately returned from their visit of inquiry and were now furnished with facts and experimental testimony. This included, the article promised, volumes of official testimony in favor of the emancipated. Such evidence, the editors assured, would be sufficient to silence their opponents and refute all the arguments leveled against immediate emancipation. While much of the data the two men collected focused heavily on evaluating free labor's success, the colored American accentuated the social condition of the emancipated, who were praised for their quietness, their industry, their respect for the laws, and their attention to moral improvement and religious duties. If freedom could create such marked improvements on the condition of, as they put it, 800,000 freemen sprang into existence from the horrid chattel system, the paper argued, it could as well disenthrall and redeem 2 million of bleeding slaves in America. I should, of course, say, and my book delves into this with some depth, these moral reform arguments were often divorced from reality. The reality of free Black life in the West Indies, where the transition to freedom was fraught with contention, to put it mildly. Much as former slaves balked against the post-emancipation labor regime, upsetting abolitionist and imperial dreams of free labor success, former slaves also resisted the surveillance and control instituted by missionaries in cooperation with colonial authorities. Some openly ignored the Sabbath or left white-run churches where they found the preaching condescending or contradictory to their new lives. Freed women withdrew their labor from the fields, but also kept up participation in market economies and organized their families in ways not always congruent with missionary expectations. Missionaries themselves complained of the continued disorderly conduct of the former slaves, their use of music and dance, their defiance of prescribed behavior, and the continued prevalence of practices like obeah and nihilism. Still, despite these clear challenges, African-American elites insisted on the reformative power of emancipation, in great part because the British Caribbean served to them as evidence in thwarting slavery at home. Within its pages, the Colored American boasted that the former West Indian slaves had shown a rapid improvement in understanding and readily acquiesced to the requirements of free society. If this was the case in a place like Jamaica, the paper pondered, where slaves had been kept in a deplorably backward state, then greater moral cultivation would certainly be a possible result, probable result in Virginia and the Carolinas. The West Indies, the paper made plain, offered a specimen of what the slaves of the American South can and will become once liberated from the degrading oppression of slavery. If I could have the next slide, Allison, please. Yes, also from the Library Company of Philadelphia, a very popular image that many of you may know, to the Friends of Negro Emancipation. And this was created in August 1st, 1834 in London. And in some ways, it shows this vision that many abolitionists had, and you could say many free African Americans also have, of what freedom in the British West Indies would entail, right? You have a man in the center, a former slave who's now freed. He's trampling a whip at his feet. His children are breaking chains. I'm assuming that this one child is digging a hole perhaps to bury these chains. Beside him, his wife is sitting there holding up their child. To their side is a Bible. I'm assuming it's a Bible, it's a book of some sort, but this is the idea that they hope that freedom will bring about, right? So this is the image many tried to foster. And moving on to my last point, because I have little time here. For African Americans, the emancipated British West Indies was in reality more than a specimen for the end of slavery in the United States. It also served as a possible model for expanded democracy and citizenship. Black political activism in the United States had long maintained that achieving equality remained impossible while slavery existed as an institution. Slavery's existence contributed to their ongoing marginalization, the passage of anti-Black laws, and calls from racial conservatives, basically for their removal from the country. In evoking the emancipated British Caribbean in their struggle against slavery, free African Americans simultaneously fought for their own social inclusion. The emancipated West Indies, from their perspective, was part of a larger experiment, a post-emancipation society that offered a ready template to help imagine the working of racial democracy in America. African Americans paid special attention to those people of color in the British West Indies who had been free before the passage of abolition. For free Black elites in the United States, these were men and women more closely related to themselves and thus even better poised to exploit the opportunities of freedom. In an 1838 article, the Colored American quoted a visiting American professor to the West Indies who claimed to find among the previously free populace an advancement in knowledge and mental development corresponding with their advancement in privileges. Free Blacks in the West Indies, it was said, had benefited chiefly from emancipation, attaining positions as mechanics, merchants, and magistrates, alongside the civil liberties due free subjects of the British Crown. By superior industry, the paper claimed, the previously free people of color had driven the lower order of whites from trades as diverse as masons, tailors, and smiths. While the latter lived often in the lower state of poverty and wretchedness, the paper said, the free Black population thrived. The article asked why the same should not be for the United States when former slaves were made free and protected by law. To be clear, to make this clear once again, the realities of social inequality in the emancipated West Indies were hardly so sanguine. While free colored served in colonial legislators, discrimination remained prevalent and suffrage was unattainable to most free people in the West Indies. In Guyana, voting required payment of a £5 minimum in taxes, making it financially prohibitive for the working class. In Barbados, even after passage of a franchise bill, less than 5% of the colony could vote by the end of the 1840s. Disfranchisement along race, color, and caste could be found throughout the colonies, leaving political and social control to a small, mostly white elite. Yet the perception of social elevation of the free people of color in the West Indies upon emancipation reflected African Americans' hopes for their own inclusion in American democracy. If former slaves and free persons in the British West Indian colonies could be elevated to share the rank of American citizens, the success of British emancipation was even used to directly rebut the stated rationale of groups like the American Colonization Society. We suppose, in an 1838 Colored American editorial stated, that sincere colonizationists in this country who have learned that the Blacks of the West Indies are all turned loose will be anxious to know what expedient the whites are adopting to get rid of the nuisances and save their country from the horrors of amalgamation. The article went on to critique the racial hysteria propagated by the American Colonization Society and demanded an answer for the absence of similar hysteria in the United States. The culmination of this ongoing discourse were annual commemorations of August 1st, in which African Americans and their allies vociferously marshaled their defenses of British emancipation, right? The public defense of the British emancipation took on increased relevance as one of the pillars of the experiment, the success of free labor, suffered an economic shock, right? This happens when English Parliament in 1846 passes sugar duties, opening up free trade, placing West Indian sugar planters in direct competition with foreign slave markets. The result is a total collapse of the West Indian sugar market, right? And in this case, you see detractors of British emancipation in the United States basically seize on this. The economic downturn is proof of the failure of free labor. African Americans, however, remained undaunted and steadfast in their defense. Most had not placed their stock wholly in the free labor argument. The moral uplift of former West Indian slaves had always proven the worthier argument, elevating experiment success to a higher plane, one better adapted to reflect their own personal strivings. And so I want to go ahead and wrap this up because I know I'm running out of time really quickly. Free African Americans, it was often these issues have long been the ones that truly mattered, more important than the calculating of exports and agricultural products that free labor could offer. Some, in fact, place freedom itself as the greatest accomplishment of British emancipation. At an 1848 August 1st commemoration in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass himself placed the emancipation of what he called his disenthralled brethren in the Caribbean greater than the political revolutions then sweeping Europe. He defended the success of British emancipation, and in comparison to America, who he claimed had been degraded by the slave whip, right? And he reminded his audience that in contrast to the West Indies, at that very moment, 3 million slaves clanked their galling fetters in the United States. In his wording, Douglass blurred the lines of the former slaves of the West Indies and free African Americans, casting both as members of the injured race, which a truthful recounting of the success of British emancipation would help free. He went on to chastise white Americans for providing slavery with moral, constitutional, political, and religious support, while eulogizing the Virginia slave rebel, Nat Turner. Before a crowd of hundreds, Douglass praised Turner as a man of noble courage, whose strike for liberty, much like emancipation in the West Indies, was the work of a God of justice. So in conclusion, my talk today has hopefully shown that for free African Americans of the antebellum era, the failure or success of emancipation in the British Caribbean mirrored concerns of their own perceptions and social standing in the United States. It was not enough that the former West Indian slaves were free, but also proved their readiness to become citizens in a democratic society, much as free Blacks in America sought to do the same. Towards this end, African Americans embarked on a vigorous defense of the experiment of immediate emancipation. This counter-argument refuted claims of disaster and ruin, and instead promoted the reformative power of freedom to morally elevate the degraded and downtrodden. In the inaugural issue of the North Star, Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass dedicated the name and symbol of the anti-slavery paper to the freedom in the West Indies and connected it intimately to the struggle of freedom in America. Of all the stars in this brave old overhanging sky, the North Star is our first choice, they proclaimed. To thousands now free in the British dominions, it has been the star of freedom. To millions now in our boasted land of liberty, it is the star of hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dexter. That was a wonderful talk. I have some questions here, and I'll go ahead and ask them. The first thing I wanted to say was that in my memory of working on this, that Black abolitionists or abolitionists, US abolitionists often use the phrase where they compared monarchical Britain to democratic America. And democratic America was, the evil were the bad guys, and monarchical Britain, who after all had in some sense enslaved, North Americans, Americans in the colonies, turned out to be on the side of right. So that was just one memory that I had.
Yeah, it was a way of shaming the United States in a sense, right?
Exactly.
This vaulted republic can't do as well as a monarchy. Yeah.
Right. All right. So let me ask the first question.
Sure.
Let me see. To what extent were African Americans free or enslaved in the US, and Black people in the British Indies related or familiar with one another?
I mean, that's a good question. And it's a bit complicated. I mean, certainly there is a shared relationship. There's long been a shared relationship, especially with the British West Indies, through the fact that the United States, English colonies, closely related to a lot of things happening in the British Caribbean. So you had people who had kin in both places. People like John Rushforth were Jamaican born and come to the United States. So there was always that relationship. For the most part, however, when we're talking about, and we can find a lot of enslaved people moving back and forth, but for these free African Americans, especially elites, for the most part, I don't want to overemphasize that there is a great form of interaction between them, but they are aware of each other, right? Especially African Americans. Some have even mused that words like people of color may come from them paying attention to this word usage being done in the Caribbean, right? And so I would say for a lot of this interaction and who notices who has to do a lot with activists and elites who are much more paying attention to each other. For instance, enslaved, you can imagine that many enslaved West Indians are not fully aware of what's happening elsewhere. They have their own issues to deal with. And we know this with some of the envoys, like the two envoys, Kimball and Thome, who go there, and they meet some of these formerly enslaved people in places like Antigua and elsewhere. And, and basically they're working on these plantations. Their owners haul them out to talk to these two white men they don't know, who seem to be dined and feted by their owners. And they give these speeches about slavery in America. And, we can't know what the enslaved people are actually thinking, because this comes from Kimball and Thome trying to figure out. And many of them may have a good reason to keep quiet. They mostly nod politely. And one or two will say, well, we'll pray for those enslaved people in America too, right? And some make comments that, interestingly, one person makes an interesting comment that, well, God came here and he'll come to America. I thought it was interesting that he didn't say Britain freed us here, but this was divine justice in a sense, and some kind of divine providence will also come to America. And so it's hard to know. But again, I think any knowledge between them was probably much more among elites in both places. Yeah.
So this is an aside, but I've been writing about divine providence in my work actually today. So do you want to say a couple of words about divine providence and its at least rhetorical function in the cause of emancipation in the West Indies as well as the United States?
In the United States, yeah, this form of Jubilee, right? Jubilee taken from the Bible, this notion that at the end of the day, and this is what abolitionists often argue, right? That what is happening is not simply a moral wrong, it's a wrong against God, right? And that some form of divine providence or judgment will take place against the United States, right? Some abolitionists even evoke Haiti as, look, you have the choice. You can either take this peaceful manner of ending slavery, or you can face a San Domingo. Some of them make that threat. And of course, when the Civil War happens, you'll see this rhetoric used often, right? That this is what we've reaped this. Even Lincoln himself, right, in his basically says, we've reaped this.
It's a great, powerful tool. you know, yeah. Okay, on to the next question. Let me see. Did the abolitionists, such as the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, use the example of the successful end of slavery in the West Indies in their own efforts to end slavery in the U.S.?
I don't know directly. I can't speak directly for the PAS. I know that the use of British emancipation to end slavery once it begins and when slavery takes this immediate turn. I will say that it's used among various abolitionists, right? As fractured as the abolitionist movement is, even when the abolitionist movement splits apart and goes into its many different phases and different groups, the one thing that was interesting was that especially on August 1st, you could see them all come together, right? People who may have had animosities, people who had different ideologies, may have all come together to agree on this notion. And you also see the idea of British emancipation being a success used not only by abolitionists, but also much more figures I would call much more anti-slavery, many more moderates, or even certain political abolitionists. You see them using this rhetoric. So it becomes, in some ways, universally used by a lot of different segments of both abolitionists and the larger anti-slavery movement, right? Even if they may not always align in their own understandings of what strategies there are for freedom.
Great. Okay. Next question. To what extent did any freed Black individuals from the West Indies emigrate to the U.S.?
I'm certain it's interesting that you can find, it's funny, it's something that I want to look into further, because certainly you can find evidence of free Black people with last names like Barbados, and it turns out they're from Barbados and others. And so there is, to some degree, some form of immigration. But actually, much more interesting, to me, at least in the book, were those African Americans who at one point attempted to immigrate to the Free British Caribbean. As a portion of my book I speak about, by about 1838 or so, 1839, especially in places like Guyana and Trinidad, these British crown colonies that never had large enslaved populations. You see many of them start looking around for people to do this work. And they are getting a lot of pushback and resistance from the enslaved populations there. And we know that a lot of them later on will look towards South Asian indentures. But before that, they try a lot of different things. They try bringing in Africans themselves, some of them captured on slave ships by the British. They sometimes take them to these Caribbean colonies to work. But they also, there's a short movement to entice free African Americans to come to Guyana, to come to Trinidad, to come to Jamaica and Barbados to do the work, to labor. And they promote this in cities like Boston, in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, right? They promote that free African Americans come here. And they use, in some ways, they kind of exploit what they know or African American understanding of freedom in the West Indies. They kind of exploit that to say, hey, if you come here, you'll have a much greater chance. We will offer you freedom. You won't have to worry about the issues of racism and oppression that you face in the United States. Come here and work. And this does become enticing to some, and it becomes an issue, right? Especially from certain African American elites who are worried that some African Americans may abandon the cause and flee to the British West Indies, but some do immigrate to these regions. And well, it doesn't turn out to be the best story. They find, of course, that the British want them to do terrible backbreaking work that the former enslaved people had done. And many of them actually return. But for a moment there is this short-lived immigration movement of free African Americans to the British West Indies that, again, I talk about, not in depth, but to some degree within the book.
So that's so interesting, because I think immigration to Haiti is much better known.
Yes.
It was a bigger movement, and I'm thinking of somebody like J.T. Holly, who goes and writes a lot back to, so this is the 1850s, to the Anglo-African magazine, and it's a very organized movement that lasts a long time, and most of the time, as you said, does not end well.
Does not end well, right? And I think most
Does
people know
not
about,
end
of course, Liberia. Most people know
Yeah,
Haiti,
yeah.
but there hasn't really been a lot of work done on the British West Indies, even though similarly, though it's short-lived in the 1830s, it pops up again. We see it pop up after the Fugitive Slave Act. Whenever there's a dire moment, we see again this call to move to the British West Indies. And think about it, the British West Indies is an English-speaking place.
Right.
It is very nearby. Some people feel, well, this is easier to go here than to go to West Africa. They even say we could try it if we don't like it. And so there are all of these reasons that some people have this reason to go there. Now, of course, most won't, but it is a form of contention within the Black community.
Right.
People are arguing that perhaps we should go to these places. And so there's a way that if you couple this with the fact that there's this constant discourse about the British West Indies and their end of slavery, that there is this annual event every year. The British West Indies as a possible place of escape to freedom is not so surprising.
I have a couple more questions, but I have to give my guests the first words, and if there's time at the end, I'll ask some more questions. Okay, this is from my friend Michelle. Were there any repatriation efforts by those enslaved in the West Indies?
You mean repatriation efforts supposedly to West Africa? I suppose maybe that's what they must mean. And I'll say, if that's what they mean, yes. There are to Sierra Leone. There's a great work written, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it talks about, especially from places like Barbados, there's a movement to take former West Indians and have them migrate to places like West Africa and to the colony of Sierra Leone, British colony of Sierra Leone. And I'm blanking on the name of the book right now, but it's a great book written on that. Okay. Somebody might put it in the chat. They might.
Okay, all right. At the end of the day, what impact, if any, did the emancipation of enslaved Blacks in the West Indies have on the eventual end of slavery in the U.S.?
You know, that's a great question. And it's something that I've come to at the end of my book, where I was like, okay, and now what? Because there's an interesting contradiction, right? And you kind of see it in the end where Douglass is evoking people like Nat Turner and others, especially as the abolitionist movement for free African Americans especially turns much more forceful, much more militant. You see much more calls for perhaps slavery needs to end through violent means, right? Perhaps it's inevitable that there's going to be a violent end to slavery. And what's interesting there is that so much early on of British emancipation had been, no, this is the peaceful way, right? This is the way it can end instead of violence, right? And so what you begin to see, however, in the writings, in the rhetoric, what you begin to see in the August 1st commemorations, by the time we hit the 1850s, we're going through this era of crisis, dealing with slavery, is this much more forceful notion that, look, this is your last chance. You're going to do it. You either do it through free, you either do it this way, or it's going to have to be, as you said, divine providence, or violence, or some form of militant action is going to have to be taken, right? And you do have some free African Americans who even begin to say, why are we even celebrating British emancipation? We should be celebrating the Haitian Revolution or something like that. We should be valorizing Nat Turner instead, right? Instead of holding this annual commemoration. And Douglass rebuts him and says, like, well, I understand what you're saying, but he says, understand that British emancipation wasn't given to the enslaved people. He said they also rebelled, right? He brings up the Baptist rebellion in Jamaica, basically, and says, you know, on basically the catalyst to pretty much end British slavery. He says, like, they rebelled, and so they forcefully seized their freedom, right? And so all this to say, even though in the end, of course, American slavery is going to end through violence, right? It's going to end through terrible violence is what it's going to bring it about. You could say in one end, you could cynically say, well, the abolitionists, that entire mission failed. But I would argue, and I argue in my book, in my conclusion, no, these events, this discourse was still this way to organize around all of these issues against slavery, against discrimination, against all of these things. It was a mass movement, right, in order to do this. And so even though, yes, slavery ends in violence and so forth, I mean, to declare that, because some people declared like, well, I guess it was a failure. I said that would be like declaring abolitionism itself a failure, right? Who most abolitionists were not advocating the eventual civil war to end slavery. But you'll see that once the Civil War comes, abolitionists, for the most part, join in and basically say, okay, this is going to have to be a crusade, right? A violent crusade to end slavery. And interestingly, during that time, it's interesting to see, and I'm working on a paper on that, how the rhetoric of British emancipation changes to adapt to this, right? Where there's still this defense and success, but now we need to use British emancipation to press the Union to make this a war to end slavery, right? We see especially at the beginning of the Civil War to the point in which this is the point of the Emancipation Proclamation. So all this to say, there is, I think it plays a chief role in helping organize people to make these issues, to make the issues of slavery as well as discrimination very well known to many people, right? It serves that purpose. And, you know, also, as I point in my book, there's a role that the former West Indian slaves themselves play in this, right? They kind of give a glimpse of what the post-emancipation is going to be and all of its imperfections, right? That this notion that you will simply recreate the old system where the formerly enslaved want to go cut all your sugarcane and do all the things they did before, and that they don't have their own agency, that's not going to work, right? And so there are ways that their resistance kind of forces the abolitionists, free African Americans in the United States, to change their arguments, right? To shift their arguments to focusing on the issue of freedom itself rather than free labor success and these other things, right? So it plays an important role.
Okay,
great. I think so, certainly. It's what I argue, yeah.
From April Maston, how did the freed people of color respond to the less than egalitarian situation they faced in the West Indies after emancipation? Did many of them migrate to England or elsewhere?
You know, for the most part, what you see in many of these places are, let's take Trinidad, for instance. You have free African American elite. They attempt to, in many ways, I don't want to say, but in many ways they do. They attempt to utilize emancipation towards creating this larger notion of identity. And you see this as well in Barbados among the free people of color, even if some of them have been slaveholders, places like Barbados, right? Once slavery is over, they try to reorient it and try to create this larger Black identity among the enslaved population, who are now the larger number, who are now, you know, make up a large portion of the population. And this, of course, doesn't always work out, right? There are tensions there between many of the formerly enslaved and these free coloreds, these free people of color. And so after slavery, you see many of them attempting to use emancipation to press for greater rights for themselves, right? And in some places, depending on where you are, we will see some of them are able to do so, at least for a while, in places like Jamaica, or, you know, and become magistrates or other things. In other places, it's less so. And so they have their own agendas in some ways of what emancipation will mean for them. And some of them try to bring in the enslaved people to help them do so. And some of them, however, in many societies, there is a large division of caste, right? And you see great tension between the two.
Okay.
And hi, April. April was my advisor and for my doctoral work. So great to hear from you, April.
Okay, and now there are still more questions coming in. Why did enslavers accept compensated emancipation in the British West Indies, but not in the American states?
That's a question. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, I know the British, I mean, they accept it in the British colonies because they're kind of told, look, slavery's going to end, right? So you can either get something out of it or not. I mean, I'm being a little generalizing here, but in many ways, right? After the long way to push, after the Baptist Rebellion, the Christmas time rebellion in Jamaica, the writings on the wall that slavery is going to end, right? And I'm not going to go into the many debates about why Britain decides to end slavery. Right? That's long been a great deal of contention among a lot of people that I'm not going to rehash here. But certainly even planters who, balk at this, you have some who basically, like some in the Jamaican legislature, for instance, I think these planters will say, look, we don't like this. We don't want slavery to end, but we better get ahead of it and find a way to control it for our own benefits. You see them trying to pass their own laws, more restrictive laws against fragrancy and these kinds of things. And the indemnity is one of these things to sweeten the pot for them, right? They accept. As far as why American slaveholders don't accept it, when people like, Lincoln and others offer it, that's a bit more complicated, right? Part of it simply has to do with the nature of the South, which is going to be different from a group of colonies that have to worry about the British Empire, right? Those colonies can't form up and create an army to fight as the way the South does, and so I don't know that the South would ever accept it, some type of compensated emancipation. And interestingly, to talk about abolitionists in the United States certainly were not ready to offer it. Right? Even if they don't have political power, they were adamant against such things. Right. They were always adamant. And they're adamant against it because of what they saw happen in British emancipation, right? And I will say that the one place it does happen, I believe, is in DC, right? Where they do accept it, but many of the other border states during the war will not accept that kind of thing. So.
Okay, and we're at our last question, I think. Why was slavery ended so early in the British West Indies?
Oh, I mean, I don't know if it was actually ended early. It was just ended before the United. If we're comparing it, it's like it's ended before the United States. But I mean, keep in mind.
And Brazil and Cuba.
Yeah, Brazil ends it. Brazil ends it in the 1880s, and Brazilian slavery had been around at least since the 1500s, right? One of the longest running of slavery period. And so. Why Britain ends in 1834, again, I don't want to go into the many economic, political arguments and moral arguments over why they do, but it had to do with a lot of confluence of events that had been going on since the end of the transatlantic slave trade, and agitation in the metropole, and especially agitation from enslaved people who expected more, right? Expected that some amelioration from their enslavement and eventually some end to slavery. And, they really, in the West Indies, I always say it's the enslaved people who push things constantly, right? Creating space for those agitators in the metropole, right? And so there's a way that British emancipation ends in both ways. And, there are others who will bring up the questions of what role does the end of slavery in Haiti play, right? Who is the first to do it, right? Britain likes to take the mantle, but it's actually Saint-Domingue, it's actually Haitians who self-emancipate themselves, right? So what role does the issue of Haiti play in this is a great question, depending on who you ask. On the one hand, certainly there are abolitionists who use Haiti as a warning, but there are also pro-slavery folks, as you saw, who use Haiti as a reason to not have emancipation. So I don't know what role it plays there, but certainly if you're comparing it to the United States, it's just hard because they have their own dynamics of things that have been going on in Britain, at least since the American Revolution, that impact a lot of different factors that lead them down this road. But I don't even say it's earlier, because if you think about Britain is the chief slave trader throughout much of the 18th century, right? And so they profited quite a bit before they finally decide to end slavery. So.
Well, the other thing I'm thinking is that it was actually a long process, because it starts with the abolition of the slave trade. And that's many decades, and that ends in 1808. And I was thinking of, in 1808, the way in which then January 1, every year becomes a day of Jubilee as well. Yes. So that's kind of
and there are basically, from that point on, enslaved people are expecting more. You have some reformers who are expecting more, and there are a lot of different factors that basically end up pushing things towards.
So it takes from 1808, the end of the slave trade, to 1833 for it actually.
Right, and it takes, and it's a lot. When that happens, even some reformers, who are fighting to end the slave trade, do not have in mind that you're going to have emancipation right away. They see some long process of gradual emancipation, or even emancipation simply happening automatically, and because basically they think that there are going to be all these reforms in which slavery may have to die out on its own. But nobody's a predictor of history. No one sees that it's going to end in 1833. A lot of factors take place.
Yeah. But there was that whole vein of thought in British thinking that slavery, in the course of history will dictate that slavery will come to its natural end.
Certainly. And you have the English long thinking, right? That slavery is something that happens in the colonies, and this notion of progress and so forth, that slavery has become antithetical to that. So these are all the different factors. There's so many things going into this pot here. British self-perceptions of themselves and identity, especially that come out after the American Revolution, the questions about that come about after the Napoleonic. There's just a lot of things. Napoleonic Wars. There are a lot of different factors that go into it, into what eventually leads Britain down that road. But you're right. It is a convoluted path.
Yeah. So I had a question. My dates are a little bit mixed up, but I'm thinking of slave rebellions, in particular in Jamaica. And that's my heritage, Jamaica. So I always, the Jamaicans were pretty rowdy people, right? as slaves go. So I'm thinking of the whole of maroon communities and then rebellions. Now, the Morant Bay rebellion is a lot later.
Yeah, it takes place after, in fact. And by the way, that's going to it plays its own role in the United States because it takes place basically after the Civil War. And here you have many people say, oh, I thought you abolitionists were saying that things were going to be so peaceful after emancipation. What's this? Is this what's going to happen here? And you see many, the Liberator and others have to trot back out the old arguments about success, but they have to refashion it because even to them, they have to say, why does Morant Bay happen? And it becomes an issue. So, yeah.
But my question is this whole, the phenomenon of maroonage, and then, which is a form of rebellion, right? And then rebellion. So to what extent was there that kind of activity on the part of slaves that might have led into 1833?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a question how much, depending on where you are, how much marronage plays a role. Marronage can itself be in so many different ways. And, you have certainly in the 1730s, you have the large Maroon Wars that are fought in Jamaica, where they're literally fighting the British Army to a standstill in many ways. I think it gets a little complicated, right? I know I get in trouble for this sometimes when I bring this up to my Jamaican friends, that some of they make treaties with some of these Maroons, who then in some Maroons become slave catchers. They become the ones who put down rebellions, right? They put down major rebellions. And there's a way that in becoming, these auxiliaries for the crown, they are both, and sometimes they're playing both sides. Some of these Maroon groups are playing both sides. They're slow to end the rebellions, or it turns out they're arming some of the rebels. And so it's always hard to know exactly what role they sometimes play. I would say that some of the major rebellions, I think like, Hilary Beckles and others, or Vincent Brown has shown, has come interestingly at times from the drivers themselves, the people you wouldn't expect on the plantations. Right, one of these last rebellions, which really shakes up things and becomes the catalyst, the Christmas Time Rebellion in 1831 to 1832, that becomes like the real death knell of slavery in the British Caribbean, has religious inspirations, Baptist inspirations, often called the Baptist War. And so there are a lot of different factors. If I will say this about marronage and rebellions in particular, I think there's something to be said about Maroons and various forms of resistance, whether it's day-to-day or what have you, creating a type of rebellious spirit, right? That people can take up. That rebellion can be a lot of different things, right? But I don't want to overdo it. Of course, many people are trying to survive slavery. Not everyone is running, to have rebellions, but certainly there is this resistant spirit, this push against the boundaries of slavery that marronage, despite its complications with the Jamaican Maroons, certainly contributes to this larger ethos of rebellion, I think, in Jamaica and elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay, good. And I guess off of that, I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A, so I'm just asking mine at this point.
Sure.
So, and now I forgot what I was going to ask. Well, there we go. We were talking about maroonage, forgot it.
Happens.
Just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, we got a Q&A. We got a question.
Sure.
Thank you. Your presentation was great. Okay. All right.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that as well.
So I'm still trying to think of the question I was going to ask, but it's not coming. Okay. All right. So anybody else? We have, oh, we only have 2 minutes late, so I couldn't even ask a question. Round of applause for Dexter, for Dr. Gabriel. Very well done. It was great talk. I learned a lot.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for LCP for allowing me to have all those wonderful images. I want everyone to know that if you want to know some more of those images, like those political cartoons and all that, you can find them all at the library company. They're digitized. You can look them up. You can blow them up to read all those little balloons to see what each is saying. They're fascinating
and the
to
curatorial
understand
staff
how much British emancipation played in this role. Yeah.
The curatorial staff is absolutely fabulous. They'll find things that you didn't even know you were looking for. So shout out to Professor Gabriel and shout out to the library company.
Thank you everyone for coming out on this Thursday. My days are running. Thank you for coming out on this Thursday evening to listen to this talk. Thank you guys very much.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everybody.